In the scorching sands of Tel El Amarna, archaeologists recently uncovered something that would make even the most seasoned Egyptologist's blood run cold. 17 bodies, perfectly preserved, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Their hands were bound with golden wire, their mouths stuffed with precious linens, and most disturbing of all, they were buried alive in small chambers beneath what was once the grand palace of Queen Nefertiti. These weren't common criminals or prisoners of war. The jewelry still clinging to their decomposed bodies, the fine Egyptian cotton wrapped around their limbs, the intricate tattoos marking their skin, all pointed to one chilling conclusion. These were members of the royal court itself. For over 3,000 years, the world has celebrated Nefertiti as the epitome of beauty and grace, the beloved wife of the revolutionary pharaoh Akhenaten. But what if everything we thought we knew about this iconic queen was nothing more than carefully crafted propaganda? Before we continue with the story of how Nefertiti's true nature was hidden from history, tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from. And don't forget to subscribe to uncover more dark secrets from ancient Egypt, because what we're about to reveal will forever change how you see one of history's most famous faces. The truth about Nefertiti's reign of terror begins not with her rise to power, but with the systematic elimination of anyone who dared question her authority. In the 14th century before Christ, Egypt was experiencing one of the most radical transformations in its 3,000-year history. Pharaoh Akhenaten had abandoned the traditional pantheon of gods, declaring that only Aten, the sun disk, deserved worship. This religious revolution had torn the country apart, creating deep divisions between the old priesthood and the new order. At the center of this chaos stood Nefertiti, whose very name meant the beautiful one has come. The new capital of Akhenaten, modern-day Tel El Amarna, rose from the desert like a fever dream. Massive temples dedicated to Aten stretched toward the horizon, their open courtyards a stark contrast to the dark, mysterious sanctuaries of the old gods. The city buzzed with activity as thousands of workers, artists, scribes, and nobles flocked to serve the new regime. Unlike the conservative atmosphere of Thebes or Memphis, Akhenaten pulsed with revolutionary energy. Artists depicted the royal family in unprecedented intimacy, showing them eating, playing with their children, and worshipping under the life-giving rays of Aten. But beneath this facade of religious enlightenment and artistic freedom, something far more sinister was taking root. Nefertiti, who had been elevated to the unprecedented position of co-pharaoh alongside her husband, wielded power with an iron fist wrapped in golden bracelets. The queen's daily routine began before dawn, with reports from her extensive network of spies. These weren't the traditional informants of previous pharaohs, focused on external threats or military intelligence. Nefertiti's agents infiltrated every level of society, from the humblest servants to the highest-ranking priests. The palace itself reflected this atmosphere of paranoia and control. Built around a central courtyard where Nefertiti held court, the structure featured an intricate system of hidden passages and listening chambers. Servants whispered that the walls themselves had ears, and they weren't entirely wrong. The queen had ordered the construction of narrow corridors behind every major room, allowing her trusted agents to monitor conversations throughout the palace. Even the royal dining hall, where elaborate banquets celebrated the glory of Aten, contained secret alcoves where scribes recorded every word spoken by the guests. The population of Akhenaten lived in constant uncertainty. While the official propaganda proclaimed a golden age of peace and prosperity under Aten's blessing, the reality was far more complex. Merchants complained that trade routes had been disrupted by the religious changes, as foreign kingdoms grew suspicious of Egypt's new monotheistic fervor. Craftsmen found their traditional religious motifs banned, forcing them to adapt their skills to the new artistic style or face unemployment. Even the children in the palace schools learned a carefully edited version of Egyptian history, one that painted the old gods as demons and portrayed Akhenaten and Nefertiti as divine saviors. Yet it was among the nobility where Nefertiti's true nature first began to reveal itself. The queen demanded absolute loyalty, not just to the new religion, but to her personally. She established a council of 12 trusted advisors, all women from powerful families, who had sworn sacred oaths of devotion. These women, known as the Daughters of Aten, served as both counselors and enforcers of the queen's will. They wore distinctive golden collars inscribed with hieroglyphs that roughly translated to "She who speaks with the voice of a 10." But those who understood the more subtle meanings of Egyptian religious language knew the inscription actually meant something far more ominous. She who decides who lives and who dies. The daily life in Nefertiti's court followed rigid protocols that seemed to change without warning. Courtiers never knew if a casual comment about the old gods, a moment of insufficient enthusiasm during religious ceremonies, or even a glance that lasted too long might be interpreted as treason. The queen's personal bodyguards, hand-picked Nubian warriors who towered over even the tallest Egyptians, became a familiar and feared sight throughout the palace. Unlike traditional royal guards, these men carried not just weapons, but also coils of golden wire and small clay tablets inscribed with the names of suspected dissidents. As the sun set each day over the temples of Akhetaten, casting long shadows across the royal quarter, the stage was set for the systematic campaign of terror that would define Nefertiti's true legacy. The beautiful queen, who smiled benevolently in countless artistic depictions, was about to reveal a side of herself that would haunt Egypt long after her empire crumbled into dust. The first documented evidence of Nefertiti's brutal methods emerged during the 5th year of Akhenaten's reign, when a respected nobleman named Amenemheb made a fatal mistake. Amenemheb, whose family had served the pharaohs for 7 generations, controlled vast estates along the Nile and commanded the respect of both the old aristocracy and the emerging merchant class. His crime was seemingly minor. During a religious ceremony celebrating Aten, he was observed making a subtle hand gesture that had been associated with prayers to Amun, the banned king of the old gods. The ceremony took place in the great temple of Aten, a massive open-air structure where sunlight streamed down upon the worshippers without the filtering shadows of traditional temple walls. Hundreds of nobles, priests, and court officials had gathered to witness Nefertiti and Akhenaten make offerings to their chosen deity. The royal couple stood on a raised platform, their skin gleaming with sacred oils, their crowns catching and reflecting the morning light. Everything proceeded according to the carefully choreographed ritual until Amenemheb, overwhelmed by years of religious conditioning, briefly touched his forehead and heart in the ancient pattern of devotion to Amun. The gesture lasted no more than 3 seconds, but Nefertiti's eyes caught it immediately. Those present later described the change in her expression as terrifying, like watching a beautiful mask slip to reveal something predatory underneath. She continued the ceremony without missing a beat, her voice never wavering as she chanted the prescribed prayers to Aten. But her gaze remained fixed on Amenemheb for the remainder of the 2-hour ritual, and those around him began to edge away, instinctively recognizing the danger their colleague now faced. That evening, as the sun disk descended toward the western desert, Amenemheb received a summons to attend a private audience with the queen. The invitation, written on the finest papyrus and sealed with Nefertiti's personal cartouche, spoke of the queen's desire to discuss his family's continued service to the crown. Amenemheb, despite his unease, had little choice but to comply. He arrived at the palace wearing his most formal attire, accompanied by 2 of his adult sons, as was customary for such occasions. The audience chamber where Nefertiti received him was unlike any room in the traditional palaces of Egypt. Instead of the familiar columns decorated with lotus flowers and papyrus plants, the walls featured stark reliefs showing Aten's rays extending down to touch the royal family. The floor was polished black granite that reflected the light from dozens of oil lamps, creating an unsettling effect that made visitors feel as though they were walking on stars. Nefertiti sat on a throne of electrum, her famous blue crown catching the flickering light, while her Nubian guards stood motionless in the shadows. The conversation began cordially enough. Nefertiti inquired about Amenemheb's estates, his family's health, and his opinions on the new capital's construction projects. She even complimented him on his son's service in the royal guard and hinted at possible promotions for both young men. But as the evening progressed, her questions became more pointed. She asked about his dreams, whether the old gods ever appeared to him during sleep. She wondered aloud about his private prayers, his true feelings about the religious changes sweeping Egypt. Amenemheb, sensing the trap closing around him, attempted to deflect her inquiries with protestations of loyalty and faith in Aten, but Nefertiti had not achieved her position through naivety. She described his gesture during the morning ceremony in precise detail, explaining how such actions, even if unconscious, demonstrated a divided heart that could not truly serve the new order. As she spoke, her voice remained calm and melodious, the same voice that had charmed diplomats from across the known world. Yet her words carried an undercurrent of absolute finality that made Amenemheb's blood turn cold. The queen then made him an offer that was clearly no offer at all. He could prove his genuine conversion to the worship of Aten by providing her with the names of other nobles who still harbored loyalty to the old gods. In exchange, she would overlook his momentary lapse and even grant his family additional honors. The alternative, she suggested with a smile that never reached her eyes, would be most unfortunate for everyone involved. Amenemheb's response sealed his fate. Drawing upon the dignity that had sustained his family through centuries of royal service, he replied that he had no knowledge of any disloyalty among his peers, that all the nobles he knew had embraced Aten with sincere hearts. He even went so far as to suggest that perhaps the queen had misinterpreted his gesture, that in his nervousness at being in the divine presence of the royal couple, he had simply been adjusting his ceremonial necklace. The silence that followed this response stretched for what felt like an eternity. Nefertiti's beautiful face remained perfectly composed, but something shifted in her eyes, a coldness that seemed to drain all warmth from the lamplit chamber. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of a goddess, pronouncing judgment upon a mortal soul. Amenemheb and his sons were to be given 3 days to reflect upon their loyalty to the new order. They would spend this time in comfortable quarters within the palace, as befitted their noble status, and then provide their final answer to her questions. What Amenemheb didn't realize was that comfortable quarters was simply Nefertiti's euphemism for a death sentence, with a brief delay for psychological torture. The 3 days that followed Amenemheb's audience with Nefertiti became the template for a reign of terror that would claim hundreds of lives over the next decade. The comfortable quarters turned out to be a series of underground chambers beneath the palace, originally designed as cool storage areas for food and valuables during the scorching summer months. These rooms had been modified under Nefertiti's personal supervision, fitted with heavy wooden doors and staffed by guards who spoke no Egyptian, making communication with prisoners impossible. Amenemheb and his sons found themselves in separate cells, each furnished with sleeping mats, water jars, and oil lamps that burned continuously, creating an artificial day that never ended. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Without the natural rhythm of sunrise and sunset, without contact with each other or the outside world, they quickly lost all sense of time. Guards brought food at irregular intervals, sometimes after what felt like hours, sometimes after what seemed like days. The meals themselves were elaborate, featuring delicacies from across the Egyptian empire. Roasted duck from the Delta marshlands, wine from the oases, honey cakes flavored with cinnamon from distant Punt. This lavish treatment was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their imprisonment. In traditional Egyptian justice, criminals and traitors faced swift execution or hard labor in the mines. But Nefertiti had discovered something far more effective, the complete psychological breakdown that resulted from luxury combined with absolute helplessness. Her prisoners ate like kings while slowly going insane, their minds fracturing under the strain of waiting for an outcome they knew would be terrible. During this period, Nefertiti's agents spread carefully crafted rumors throughout Akhetaten. The official story was that Amenemheb and his family had been granted a special honor, chosen to participate in extended religious meditation before being elevated to important positions in the new government. Citizens were told that the family's temporary absence from public life demonstrated their deep commitment to spiritual purification. Some even expressed envy, wishing they too could be selected for such divine favor. But among the nobility, a different understanding began to take hold. Whispered conversations in garden alcoves and behind temple walls revealed that several other prominent families had also been granted similar honors in recent months. Lady Mutemwiya, whose husband had controlled the grain distribution for Upper Egypt, had disappeared into religious retreat and never emerged. General Horemheb's brother, a respected priest who had voiced mild concerns about the speed of religious changes, had been invited to undertake spiritual purification and vanished entirely from court life. The pattern was becoming clear to those brave enough or observant enough to recognize it. Nefertiti was systematically eliminating anyone who possessed the influence, resources, or moral authority to challenge the new order. Unlike traditional purges that relied on public executions to intimidate potential opposition, her method was far more subtle and therefore more effective. Each disappearance could be explained away as voluntary religious devotion, making it impossible for survivors to organize resistance or even to articulate their fears without seeming to oppose the sacred goals of spiritual purification. On the third day of their imprisonment, Amenemheb and his sons were brought before Nefertiti once again. The queen had chosen to hold this final audience in her private garden, a lush sanctuary within the palace walls where exotic flowers bloomed year-round thanks to an ingenious irrigation system that channeled water from the Nile. The setting was deliberately chosen for its beauty and tranquility, designed to lull the prisoners into a false sense of security. Nefertiti appeared more radiant than ever, her skin perfumed with rare oils, her jewelry catching the afternoon sunlight like captured stars. She inquired solicitously about their comfort during their meditation period, expressing hope that the enforced solitude had clarified their thoughts about service to Aten. Her manner suggested genuine concern for their spiritual welfare, the behavior of a benevolent ruler who truly cared about her subjects' souls. Amenemheb, his psychological reserves depleted by 3 days of uncertainty and isolation, made one last attempt to save his family. He provided Nefertiti with a list of 12 names, nobles and priests who had expressed private doubts about the religious revolution. Some of these were his genuine friends and political allies, others were rivals he had grown tired of dealing with. All were men of influence who could potentially threaten Nefertiti's consolidation of power. The queen received this information with apparent gratitude, praising Amenemheb for his wisdom in recognizing the importance of protecting Egypt from those who would drag it back into the darkness of the old superstitions. She assured him that his cooperation had earned forgiveness for his earlier transgressions and that his family would be restored to their rightful place in society. She even mentioned specific positions and honors that would be granted to his sons, painting a picture of a bright future in the service of the new order. Amenemheb left this second audience feeling a cautious optimism. Perhaps he had misread the situation. Perhaps Nefertiti was indeed the benevolent co-ruler that her public image suggested. Perhaps his cooperation had genuinely earned his family's safety. He spent that evening in his assigned quarters, planning how he would use his restored influence to navigate the dangerous political currents of Akhenaten, never suspecting that he had just signed not only his own death warrant, but also the death warrants of 12 innocent men whose only crime was trusting him with their private doubts. The beautiful queen had played the game perfectly, extracting valuable intelligence, while simultaneously ensuring that no one would be left alive to contradict the official narrative of willing cooperation and spiritual transformation. What happened next would establish the pattern that defined Nefertiti's secret reign of terror for the remainder of her time in power. Within a week of receiving Amenemheb's list, the queen's agents began extending invitations to the named individuals. Each invitation was perfectly crafted to appeal to its recipient's particular weaknesses and ambitions. General Katie, known for his military expertise, was asked to consult on fortifications for the new capital. High Priest Merenith received a request to advise on temple architecture that would better channel Aten's divine energy. Wealthy merchant Kamwaset was offered exclusive trading rights with distant kingdoms that had expressed interest in Egypt's new religious philosophy. None of these men suspected they were walking into carefully prepared traps. The invitations came through official channels, bore the proper seals, and promised opportunities that any ambitious Egyptian would find difficult to refuse. More importantly, each man believed his specific expertise was being genuinely recognized and valued by the royal court. This careful personalization was crucial to Nefertiti's method. Her victims felt honored rather than suspicious, making them eager to comply with her requests. The Queen's intelligence network had grown remarkably sophisticated during the early years of the new regime. Unlike traditional Egyptian espionage, which focused primarily on foreign threats and military intelligence, Nefertiti had created something entirely new, a comprehensive surveillance system designed to monitor the loyalty and private thoughts of her own subjects. Her agents included not just professional spies, but also servants, scribes, artisans, and even children who had been trained to report suspicious conversations or behaviors. Central to this network were the daughters of Aten, the 12 noble women who served as Nefertiti's inner council. Each of these women controlled a specific aspect of the surveillance operation. Lady Ankhesenamun monitored the military and reported on any signs of discontent among the officers. Priestess Meritaten infiltrated the religious hierarchy, identifying priests who might be secretly loyal to the old gods. Merchant Princess Sitamun tracked the flow of goods and money, watching for economic activities that might fund opposition to the regime. But perhaps the most crucial member of this inner circle was a woman known only as the Scribe, whose real name has been lost to history. This mysterious figure had been trained in the most advanced interrogation techniques known to the ancient world, methods that could break a person's will without leaving physical marks that might contradict the official narrative of voluntary cooperation. The Scribe operated from a hidden complex beneath the palace, a maze of rooms and corridors that had been carved directly into the bedrock of the desert. The techniques employed in these underground chambers represented a horrifying evolution of traditional Egyptian practices. While conventional torture relied on physical pain to extract information, the Scribe had developed methods that attacked the mind itself. Prisoners were subjected to constant light or absolute darkness for weeks at a time. They were fed drugged food that induced vivid hallucinations, making them question their own perceptions and memories. Most cruelly, they were forced to listen to recordings of their own family members, voices that had been captured during seemingly innocent social gatherings and carefully edited to suggest betrayal or abandonment. The psychological impact of these techniques was devastating and permanent. Men who had commanded armies or governed provinces emerged from the underground chambers as broken shells of their former selves, eager to confess to crimes they had never committed and to implicate friends and family members in imaginary conspiracies. The beauty of the system, from Nefertiti's perspective, was that these confessions appeared completely voluntary to outside observers. No one could accuse her of employing torture when her prisoners sang her praises and begged for the opportunity to serve the new order. Meanwhile, the families of the disappeared faced an agonizing dilemma. They knew their loved ones had been taken by the regime, but the official story was that these men had chosen to dedicate themselves to religious service. Any attempt to investigate or demand answers could be interpreted as opposition to the sacred mission of spiritual purification. Even private grief had to be hidden, since mourning for someone who had supposedly achieved spiritual elevation would be seen as evidence of insufficient faith in Aten. The psychological pressure on the surviving nobility was immense. They watched their friends and colleagues disappear one by one, knowing that any sign of fear or resistance might make them the next target. Conversations at court became stilted and artificial, with everyone speaking in the approved religious language while carefully avoiding any topic that might be construed as dangerous. Even family gatherings became tense affairs, as parents worried that their own children might be influenced by Nefertiti's agents to report on private conversations. This atmosphere of paranoia and fear suited Nefertiti's purposes perfectly. The terrorized nobility posed no threat to her authority, while the elaborate religious justifications for her actions prevented any organized resistance from forming. The Queen had discovered that fear combined with apparent legitimacy was far more effective than simple brutality. Her victims couldn't even properly articulate their situation without seeming to oppose the divine mission of Egypt's transformation. As the months passed, the efficiency of Nefertiti's system became apparent even to foreign observers. Diplomatic messages from kingdoms throughout the ancient Near East began to comment on the remarkable unity and discipline of the Egyptian court. Ambassadors reported that dissent seemed to have been entirely eliminated, that all Egyptian nobles spoke with one voice in praising the wisdom of the new religious order. What these foreign observers didn't realize was that they were witnessing not unity, but the complete suppression of opposition through methods that left no visible traces. The most chilling aspect of this campaign was its apparent success in transforming not just behavior, but belief itself. Many of the surviving nobles began to genuinely embrace the religious changes, not out of conviction, but because psychological survival required them to internalize the values of their oppressor. They praised Aten not because they had been convinced by theological arguments, but because their minds had been rewired by prolonged exposure to fear and uncertainty. The true scope of Nefertiti's operations became apparent. during the 7th year of Akhenaten's reign, when a young scribe named Hui made a discovery that would cost him his life and reveal the horrifying extent of the Queen's underground empire. Hui worked in the royal archives, a vast complex of chambers where Egypt's administrative records were stored on thousands of papyrus scrolls. His job involved cataloging and cross-referencing documents, ensuring that the kingdom's bureaucratic machinery continued to function smoothly despite the religious upheaval occurring above ground. It was routine work, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that had kept Egyptian civilization functioning for millennia. But Hui possessed a quality that made him dangerous to Nefertiti's regime: an exceptional memory for details and an analytical mind that could detect patterns others missed. Over the course of several months, he began to notice discrepancies in the official records that didn't align with his personal observations of court life. The first anomaly was subtle. Personnel records showed that dozens of high-ranking officials had been promoted to important positions in distant provinces, yet Hui had never seen any of these men leave the capital. When he mentioned this casually to a colleague, he was told that these officials had departed for their new assignments during private ceremonies that common scribes weren't privileged to witness. The explanation was plausible, but something about it troubled Hui's methodical mind. His concerns deepened when he discovered a series of sealed requisition orders bearing Nefertiti's personal seal. These documents authorized the construction of extensive underground chambers, the delivery of specialized materials, including large quantities of limestone and gold wire, and the assignment of Nubian workers who had been sworn to secrecy. The requisitions were coded in language that seemed to describe religious facilities, but the specific materials requested suggested something very different from traditional temple construction. Hui's investigation took a darker turn when he gained access to the palace's architectural plans, documents that should have been restricted to royal builders and security officials. These blueprints revealed a hidden network of tunnels and chambers extending deep beneath the palace complex, areas that didn't appear on any of the public architectural records. The chambers were connected by narrow passages that would allow for discreet movement of people and materials, and each room was equipped with ventilation systems that could be sealed at will. Most disturbing of all were the notations in the margins of these plans, written in Nefertiti's distinctive hieroglyphic style. These notes referenced chambers of purification, halls of final devotion, and rooms of eternal silence. So says, to anyone familiar with Egyptian funeral practices, the terminology was unmistakably connected to death and burial, yet these facilities were being constructed beneath a living palace rather than in the traditional necropolis across the river. Hui's growing unease reached a critical point when he encountered a document that should never have been included in the general archives. It was a detailed inventory of personal effects belonging to missing nobles, items that had supposedly been left behind when their owners departed for religious service in distant provinces. The list included jewelry, clothing, furniture, and even personal letters, all carefully catalogued and stored in unmarked chambers beneath the palace. The implication was clear. These men had not departed for new assignments. They had died in Akhenaten, and their possessions had been secretly confiscated. Armed with this evidence, Hui faced an agonizing decision. As a loyal Egyptian, he felt obligated to report his discoveries to higher authorities. But as a rational man, he understood that bringing such accusations against the Queen would almost certainly result in his own disappearance. He spent sleepless nights walking through the palace gardens, trying to decide whether his duty to truth outweighed his instinct for survival. The decision was made for him when he discovered that his own investigation had not gone unnoticed. Returning to the archives one morning, he found that several of the documents he had been studying had been removed from their usual locations. More ominously, other scribes began to avoid him, their conversations stopping abruptly when he entered a room. The signs were unmistakable. He had been identified as a potential threat and was now under surveillance. Hui's final mistake was attempting to create copies of the most damaging documents before they could be permanently removed from the archives. Working late into the night, he carefully transcribed the architectural plans and inventory lists onto fresh papyrus, intending to hide these copies outside the palace, where they might someday serve as evidence of Nefertiti's crimes. But the Queen's network of informants had grown so pervasive that even this desperate attempt at documentation was detected within hours. The end came with characteristic subtlety. Hui received a summons to meet with senior palace officials about what was described as an exciting opportunity to serve in the Queen's personal secretariat. The invitation praised his exceptional attention to detail and suggested that his skills had attracted the attention of the highest levels of government. Any ambitious scribe would have been thrilled by such recognition, and Hui's colleagues congratulated him on his apparent good fortune. But Hui had learned enough about Nefertiti's methods to recognize the summons for what it really was. The night before his scheduled meeting, he made one final attempt to ensure that his discoveries would survive his inevitable disappearance. He wrote a detailed letter describing everything he had learned, sealed it in a pottery jar, and buried it in a location he hoped would remain undisturbed. The letter was addressed to future generations, a desperate plea that someone someday would uncover the truth about what was happening beneath the beautiful facades of Akhenaten. The letter ended with words that would prove prophetic. She who appears as beauty itself has become the embodiment of death. Those who trust in her smile will find themselves wearing golden chains in chambers where the sun never shines. May the gods preserve Egypt from this queen who has made herself more terrible than any pharaoh in our long history. Hui never returned from his meeting with the palace officials. According to the records, he had been selected for an important but confidential assignment that required him to work directly under the Queen's supervision. His colleagues were told that his new duties were so sensitive that he could no longer maintain contact with his former associates, but that he was extremely pleased with the honor that had been bestowed upon him. The pottery jar containing his final testimony would remain buried for over 3 millennia, waiting for archaeologists who would finally understand the true meaning of his desperate warning. The ultimate horror of Nefertiti's reign was revealed through a series of events that began in the 9th year of Akhenaten's rule, when the Queen's own daughter, Princess Meritaten, began to question her mother's methods. Meritaten had grown up surrounded by the luxury and reverence that marked life in the royal family, but she had also witnessed the gradual disappearance of familiar faces from the court. Unlike other members of the royal household, she possessed her father's intellectual curiosity and her mother's keen observational skills, a combination that made her uniquely capable of recognizing the patterns others missed. The princess's suspicions were first aroused during a religious festival, celebrating the 7th anniversary of Aten's revelation to her parents. The ceremony was particularly elaborate, featuring processions, offerings, and speeches by dozens of nobles praising the wisdom of the new religious order. But Meritaten noticed something that chilled her blood. Many of the nobles delivering these passionate endorsements were men she had recently seen entering the palace's restricted underground sections, individuals who had emerged days or weeks later looking fundamentally changed, their eyes holding a peculiar combination of fervor and terror. Her concerns deepened when she realized that several courtiers she had known since childhood were no longer present at court functions. When she asked about these missing individuals, she was told they had been blessed with opportunities for spiritual advancement that required them to serve in distant temples or administrative posts. The explanations were always delivered with smiles and congratulations, as if these disappearances were wonderful developments that any loyal Egyptian would celebrate. Meritaten's investigation began innocently enough, with casual questions to servants and guards about the construction work that seemed to be constantly ongoing beneath the palace. She learned that entire sections of the underground complex were off-limits to normal palace staff, accessible only to Nefertiti's personal guards and a select group of specialists who had taken vows of absolute silence. The few workers who had participated in the construction had all been foreigners, mainly Nubians who spoke no Egyptian and who had been relocated to distant parts of the empire immediately after completing their assignments. The breakthrough came when Meritaten discovered a hidden entrance to the underground complex, concealed behind a false wall in a storage room adjacent to her mother's private chambers. The entrance was secured with a complex mechanism that required knowledge of specific Egyptian mathematical principles, suggesting that it had been designed by someone with advanced educational training rather than simple construction workers. Using skills her tutors had taught her for solving architectural puzzles, the princess managed to unlock the mechanism during a period when she knew her mother was occupied with diplomatic meetings. What Meritaten found beyond that hidden entrance would haunt her for the rest of her short life. The underground complex was far more extensive than even Hui's stolen architectural plans had revealed. Dozens of chambers connected by a network of passages stretched deep into the bedrock beneath Akhenaten, creating a shadow palace that mirrored the structure above ground. But where the surface palace celebrated life, light, and the glory of Aten, these underground halls were dedicated to something far more sinister. The first chambers Nefertiti encountered contained what appeared to be workshops where Nefertiti's specialists perfected their psychological torture techniques. Tables held detailed notes describing the effects of various combinations of drugs, sensory deprivation, and carefully crafted lies designed to break down a prisoner's sense of reality. The walls were covered with diagrams showing human anatomy, not for medical purposes, but to illustrate the most effective pressure points for causing psychological rather than physical pain. But it was in the deeper chambers that Nefertiti discovered the true extent of her mother's crimes. Room after room contained the preserved bodies of Nefertiti's victims, each prepared for burial, using techniques that surpassed even traditional Egyptian mummification. These were not the crude disposal of murdered enemies, but elaborate funeral preparations that had transformed death into a grotesque art form. The bodies were wrapped in the finest linens, adorned with jewelry that had been specifically crafted for their eternal rest, and placed in sarcophagi that bore inscriptions praising their voluntary sacrifice for the glory of Aten. The most horrifying discovery was a chamber that contained detailed records of each victim's final moments. Nefertiti had not simply killed her enemies, she had documented their psychological destruction with the thoroughness of a scholar studying natural phenomena. Papyrus scrolls described how long each victim had resisted before accepting their fate, what arguments had proven most effective in breaking their will, and how their final statements could be edited to serve as propaganda for the regime. Among these records, Nefertiti found accounts that revealed the truth about the 17 bodies that would someday be discovered by archaeologists. These individuals had not been randomly selected victims, but rather a carefully chosen group that included some of Egypt's most respected nobles, priests, and intellectuals. They had been killed not in moments of rage or fear, but as part of a calculated plan to eliminate everyone who possessed the knowledge, influence, or moral authority to challenge Nefertiti's transformation of Egyptian society. The method of their execution was described in clinical detail. Each victim had been given a choice. They could drink a potion that would render them unconscious before being buried, or they could face burial while fully aware. The records indicated that most had chosen the potion, but several had refused, preferring to meet death with full consciousness rather than submit even in their final moments to Nefertiti's control. These individuals had been buried alive in small chambers, their hands bound with golden wire to prevent them from clawing their way out, their mouths stuffed with sacred linens to muffle their final cries. But perhaps the most chilling document Nefertiti discovered was a detailed plan for the future of Egypt under Nefertiti's continued rule. The queen had mapped out a systematic campaign to eliminate not just individual opponents, but entire social classes that might pose threats to her authority. Traditional priests, military officers with independent power bases, wealthy merchants who maintained international connections, even members of the royal family who showed signs of independent thinking, all were marked for eventual removal. The plan revealed that Akhenaten himself was not immune to his wife's suspicions. Notes in Nefertiti's handwriting described concerns about the pharaoh's occasional moments of doubt about the religious revolution, his private conversations with old advisors, and his apparent affection for their daughters, whom Nefertiti viewed as potential threats to her absolute control over the royal succession. As Nefertiti read these documents by the flickering light of an oil lamp she had brought into the underground complex, she realized that her own name appeared repeatedly in her mother's strategic notes. The princess was described as intellectually dangerous and potentially disloyal due to inherited paternal weakness. Plans were outlined for gradually isolating her from court life, followed by her eventual disappearance under the guise of a spiritual calling to serve Aten in a distant temple. The final shock came when Nefertiti discovered that her mother had been systematically poisoning Akhenaten with small doses of mercury dissolved in his daily wine. The metal was being administered in quantities too small to cause immediate death, but sufficient to gradually impair his mental faculties and make him increasingly dependent on Nefertiti's guidance. Medical notes detailed the progression of symptoms, memory loss, confusion, periods of disorientation, and most importantly, decreased resistance to his wife's suggestions and decisions. Princess Meritaten's discovery of her mother's underground empire of terror placed her in an impossible position. Armed with evidence of crimes that would shock even the most hardened Egyptian, she faced the realization that there was no authority in the kingdom capable of holding Nefertiti accountable. The queen had systematically eliminated or compromised everyone who might have challenged her actions, creating a system where she was simultaneously the perpetrator and the final judge of her own crimes. The princess spent 3 agonizing days considering her options, each more dangerous than the last. She could attempt to present her evidence to Akhenaten, but her father's mental deterioration had progressed to the point where he might not comprehend the gravity of her accusations, or worse, he might report her concerns directly to Nefertiti. She could try to flee Akhenaten and seek protection from loyal military commanders in distant provinces, but the queen's network of agents extended throughout the empire, making successful escape unlikely. The decision was ultimately made for her when Meritaten realized that her extended absence from court functions had already attracted attention. Servants began asking about her health, with the kind of pointed concern that suggested they had been instructed to monitor her activities. Her personal bodyguards, men who had protected her since childhood, were quietly replaced with new personnel who showed unmistakable signs of loyalty to Nefertiti rather than to the royal family as a whole. Recognizing that her time was running out, Meritaten made a desperate choice that would ultimately seal her fate, but also ensure that evidence of her mother's crimes would survive for future generations. She decided to create a comprehensive record of everything she had discovered, hiding multiple copies in locations throughout Akhenaten where they might escape detection during any systematic search. Working through the night, she transcribed the most damaging documents, added her own observations about the underground complex, and included detailed maps that would allow others to locate the burial chambers where Nefertiti's victims lay in their golden bondage. But the princess made one crucial mistake in her desperation to document the truth. She enlisted the help of a trusted servant, a middle-aged woman named Kia, who had served the royal family for over a decade. Kia had witnessed enough disappearances to understand the danger they all faced, and she agreed to help hide the evidence despite the enormous risk to her own life. Unfortunately, Kia's loyalty to the princess was matched by her terror of the queen, and when Nefertiti's agents approached her with offers of protection in exchange for information, the servant's resolve crumbled. The end came with the same calculated precision that had marked all of Nefertiti's operations. Meritaten received an invitation to join her mother for a private dinner, a seemingly normal family gathering that would allow them to discuss the princess's future role in the kingdom. The invitation mentioned that Akhenaten would be unable to attend due to one of his increasingly frequent episodes of illness, a detail that should have warned Meritaten of the trap she was walking into. The dinner took place in Nefertiti's private chambers, a luxurious suite decorated with the finest artifacts from across the Egyptian empire. The queen appeared more radiant than ever, her conversation flowing easily between discussions of palace gossip, plans for upcoming religious festivals, and affectionate inquiries about her daughter's happiness and well-being. The food was exceptional, featuring delicacies that had been specially prepared by the royal kitchens, and the wine was a rare vintage that had been aged in underground chambers since before Akhenaten's reign began. It was only as the evening progressed that Meritaten began to feel the effects of the drugs that had been carefully measured into her wine. The chamber seemed to grow warmer despite the cool night air flowing through the open windows. Colors became more vivid, sounds seemed to echo strangely, and her mother's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality that made it difficult to focus on the meaning of her words. Nefertiti waited until the drugs had taken full effect before revealing that she knew about her daughter's underground expedition. Speaking in tones of gentle disappointment rather than anger, the queen explained that she had been aware of Meritaten's investigation from the beginning, that every step of the princess's discovery had been carefully monitored and controlled. Even the hidden entrance had been left deliberately accessible, allowing Nefertiti to gauge the extent of her daughter's curiosity and determination. The conversation that followed revealed the true depth of Nefertiti's transformation from queen to monster. She spoke about her victims not with remorse or justification, but with the pride of an artist discussing her greatest masterpieces. Each death had been carefully planned and executed, not just to eliminate opposition, but to create a legacy of fear that would ensure absolute obedience for generations to come. She had studied the psychological techniques of priests and physicians, adapting methods traditionally used for healing into instruments of control and terror. Most chillingly, Nefertiti explained that her actions were motivated not by simple ambition or cruelty, but by a genuine belief that she was saving Egypt from the chaos and weakness that had plagued other kingdoms. In her mind, the elimination of dissent was a form of spiritual purification that would create a perfect society united in worship of Aten and obedience to royal authority. She saw herself not as a tyrant, but as a divine instrument working to achieve a higher form of civilization. As the drugs continued to cloud her thinking, Merititen found herself struggling to maintain her sense of moral outrage in the face of her mother's calm explanations. Nefertiti's voice seemed to make perfect sense, her arguments appearing logical and even compassionate. The princess began to understand how so many intelligent, strong-willed individuals had eventually submitted to the queen's will, their resistance worn away by a combination of chemical manipulation and psychological pressure that attacked the very foundations of rational thought. The final revelation came when Nefertiti explained that Meritaten's discovery of the underground complex had not been an accident, but rather a test designed to determine whether the princess possessed the strength and vision necessary to inherit her mother's empire. The queen offered her daughter a choice that echoed the options she had presented to her other victims. She could join the conspiracy, accepting her role as heir to a kingdom built on systematic terror, or she could choose to undergo the same spiritual purification that had been granted to the nobles whose bodies lay in the golden chambers below. Meritaten's response, delivered through the fog of chemical intoxication, represented perhaps the last act of genuine moral courage in Akhenaten's court. Despite her impaired condition, despite the hypnotic power of her mother's voice, despite the knowledge that resistance meant certain death, the princess rejected Nefertiti's offer with words that would have made her ancestors proud. She declared that she would rather die as herself than live as a servant of her mother's madness. Nefertiti's reaction to this defiance was not anger, but something closer to relief. She had tested her daughter and found her unworthy of the empire she had built, confirming her belief that she alone possessed the strength necessary to reshape Egyptian civilization. The queen's final words to her daughter were spoken with genuine maternal affection, expressing hope that Meritaten would find peace in the spiritual transformation that awaited her. The princess was found 3 days later in her chambers, apparently having died peacefully in her sleep. The royal physicians attributed her death to a sudden illness that had been exacerbated by the stress of her spiritual preparations for advancement to a higher level of service to Aten. Her funeral was magnificent, featuring elaborate rituals that celebrated her elevation to divine status and her eternal union with the sun god. Nefertiti's grief appeared genuine to all observers, the behavior of a loving mother mourning the loss of a beloved child. But in the underground chambers beneath the palace, Meritaten's body joined the growing collection of individuals who had chosen death over submission to Nefertiti's vision of perfection. She was prepared for eternal rest, with the same meticulous care that had been lavished on all the queen's victims, wrapped in golden wire that would bind her hands for eternity, her mouth filled with sacred linens that would ensure her silence until the end of time. The documents she had so carefully hidden were discovered within days of her death, tracked down by agents who had been monitoring her activities since her first suspicious inquiry about missing courtiers. Most of her evidence was destroyed, but some survived, buried in locations so remote or cleverly concealed that even Nefertiti's thorough searches could not locate them. These fragments would remain hidden for over 3 millennia, waiting to corroborate the testimony of archaeologists who would eventually uncover the golden chambers and their terrible contents. Nefertiti's reign of terror continued for 3 more years after her daughter's death, claiming dozens of additional victims before the queen herself vanished from historical records. Whether she died naturally, was murdered by surviving conspirators, or simply disappeared into the desert to avoid retribution, remains one of ancient Egypt's greatest mysteries. But her legacy lived on in the underground chambers of Akhenaten, where 17 bodies wrapped in golden wire bore eternal witness to the transformation of beauty into horror, of divine authority into absolute evil. The beautiful queen who had smiled from countless sculptures and paintings, whose image had been celebrated as the embodiment of Egyptian grace and wisdom, had revealed herself to be perhaps the most ruthless ruler in a civilization that had produced thousands of years of pharaohs. Her victims, bound in gold and buried alive, had taken their secrets to graves that would remain hidden until modern archaeologists finally brought their story to light, proving that even in ancient Egypt, the most beautiful faces could conceal the darkest hearts. Today, as we look upon the serene features of Nefertiti in museums around the world, we are seeing not just the face of a legendary queen, but the carefully crafted mask of a monster who transformed the cradle of civilization into a charnel house of golden chains and silent screams. The 17 bodies discovered at Tel El Amarna serve as permanent testimony to the truth that power, when unchecked by conscience or accountability, can corrupt even the most beautiful souls into instruments of unimaginable cruelty. What other secrets lie buried beneath the sands of Egypt, waiting to challenge our assumptions about the past? What other beautiful faces in ancient art might conceal the features of monsters who have escaped historical justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to uncover more hidden truths from the ancient world. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that history tried to forget.